Joining on this VOO Wednesday webinar. This webinar is to introduce the supplemental guidance to the governor's guidelines, and it's called an advanced release. So the governor's guidelines 2, revision 2, if you remember, they still are in effect. The supplemental guidance just provides additional guidance specific to program year 2018, as well as specific to program year 2017 reconciliation of budgeted to actual shared costs. So last time we sought your feedback on November 8th, 2017 for a draft version of the supplemental guidance for this upcoming program year. You made suggestions during that webinar and after that webinar. So this version of the supplemental guidance that we issue today reflects those suggestions. And the purpose of today is to introduce the supplemental guidance and walk you through some of the changes that we made, as well as to introduce some additional concepts that we embedded into the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet. Just so you know, today we're only going to focus on the concepts of the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet. There is another webinar that will be planned and formally announced to focus solely on the mechanics of the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet. That is currently slated for February 14th, 1 week from today. And once that is confirmed, you will get an invitation for that webinar that focuses more on the technical side of the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet. But today, as you heard, the advanced release is that indicates that this supplemental guidance for this upcoming program year is still pending the final approval. But we also know that you need to get started on your budget negotiations for program year 2018, and that the reconciliation process for PY17 costs of programs are underway, or at least will be very, very soon. So if you notice, this is the language on the screen. It appears at the very top of the actual supplemental guidance document that you can download. And I want to highlight that we do not anticipate that any changes will occur before it's finally approved, but we do encourage you to get going on your local budget negotiations as well as the reconciliation process if you haven't already. So we hope that these guidelines provide a little bit more support to you in both of those processes. And of course, as soon as we get that final approval, we'll let you know. But in the meantime, just make sure to keep progressing in your negotiations and your reconciliation processes. So I'll provide a little background for the rest of this webinar. We'll take you through the supplemental guidance, including the timelines, and the changes in the budget regarding the affiliate and specialized centers, and how that shows up in the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet. We'll show you all that today. We'll also recap the new outcome report that's due on April 15th, and the revised Section 12 of the MOU, which is the narrative that you have to submit with your budgets to explain the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet and how partners are sharing some of those costs. So we'll show you all of those items today. So these are just a few reminders. If you were on the November webinar with the draft version of the supplemental guidance, this will look familiar. Just a few big reminders that the MOU is good for 3 years. I think you all know that. The OneStop operating budgets must be negotiated annually, which is why we issue this annual supplemental guidance. The reconciliation of shared costs starts for program year 2017, the current year, and the first round of that reconciliation should be going on now. Infrastructure cost sharing requirements expand to affiliate and specialized centers starting July 1, 2018. And then the cost of the OneStop operators must be reflected in the budget that you start, and that becomes effective July 1, 2018. So those 5 dot points are the whole justification for why a supplemental guidance was needed this year. And these are some additional specifics about why the supplemental guidance was issued. For PY18, that means that expanding the infrastructure cost sharing and requirements to affiliate and specialized centers, and the PY17 guidance for reconciliation budgeted to actual shared costs. And because we're all a little bit smarter every time we go through these annual budget negotiations, we issue the supplemental guidance to clarify anything that came to our attention as we reviewed the local MOUs and the annual budgets. So that is, the purpose of the supplemental guidance is just to provide guidance in addition to the general process that's outlined in Governor's Guidelines Revision 2. This is the timeline that you have all seen before. It's similar to what we followed for the MOU negotiations, so you can follow the same timeline for your annual budget negotiations. So that means the next deadline to keep in mind is April 15th, when the budget negotiations should be wrapped up for your upcoming program year. That's also when your new outcome report of annual budget negotiations should be submitted to Michael Baker at the WIOA plans-MOUs at illinoisworknet.com. So we'll go through that. I'll show you that form. After that April 15th date, that's when the process starts for trying to help local areas avoid any impasse. So this can include the state-level remediation team trying to expedite our agreement or troubleshoot anything that is preventing agreement. And that takes us all the way up to July 1st, when hopefully all the local areas have agreed on a budget by then and avoided impasse. If not, then as you all know, that's when the state funding mechanism kicks in. If an impasse occurs, the governor then establishes the amount that each required partner pays in the local area for the comprehensive and affiliate and specialized centers. So April 15th is the date to keep in mind, as you all know. Again, this is something following up from our November 8th webinar. We know that affiliate and specialized centers now, starting July 1st, 2018, are subject to the same infrastructure cost requirements as comprehensive one-stop centers. And so we know that the state policy, the IWIB policy work group, is convening a diverse group and is looking at the definition of the affiliate centers in the context of one-stop certification. So anything that will be issued through that IWIB policy work group will play into how you define your affiliate and specialized centers in your local areas going forward. So we'll just watch for that. Another main concept in the supplemental guidance is how the one-stop operator costs are shown in the annual budget and in the budget narrative of your MOUs, Section 12. The supplemental guidance was revised to include your feedback from the November 8th webinar that the one-stop operator contribution, we cannot call it an in-kind contribution if partners are not sharing it. If partners are not sharing it, it's simply a contribution toward the one-stop operator. Whatever partner is contributing toward the one-stop operator cost, that is entered in the spreadsheet as a contribution toward the one-stop operator. And I will show you that in the budget spreadsheet today. So the key for PY18 is to explain how the cost of the one-stop operators are being covered, both in the notes section of the budget template, the spreadsheet, as well as in your MOU narratives. It has to be explained in the narrative portion of your MOUs too. And in short, if all the partners agree to share in the cost of the one-stop operator, then the cost is reflected as a shared cost and gets distributed across all the partners in the budget. But if partners are not sharing in the cost of the one-stop operator, or a limited number of partners are covering that cost, then it will be entered in a different line or a different section of the spreadsheet for other contributions. And there's actually a line item that is marked less contribution toward the one-stop operator. I will show you that in another screen today. So again, the one-stop operating budget spreadsheet had to be revised to accommodate the new shared cost requirements that now apply to affiliate centers and specialized centers, as well as comprehensive one-stop centers. So again, we're going to talk about the concepts today, and then we'll invite you to a future webinar, which we think will be a week from today, to go over the mechanics of it. But just the first item here, for clarity of terms, the infrastructure funding agreement is encompassed in this OneStop operating budget spreadsheet that we'll talk about. I know that that's the formal language that's in the final rules and in the federal guidance, the infrastructure funding agreement. So just so you know, that is intended and that is encompassed as part of this OneStop operating budget spreadsheet. In the center, in the spreadsheet, you'll notice that every center gets its own tab. So every comprehensive OneStop center gets its own tab, every affiliate center gets its own tab, every specialized center gets its own tab. And so that is how the spreadsheet is structured. The next concept is new for PY 2018. It's also the most complicated to implement on the OneStop operating budget spreadsheet, which I'll show you today. But the two categories of the shared service delivery system costs are relatively simple. The first type of shared delivery system cost is that those costs that are specific to one center. So the example there is a resource room specialist only serves that one center. So that shared cost is specific to Center 1, let's just say. The second category of the shared delivery system cost is a cost that applies to all the centers in the local area. And an example there is board staff costs. Those board staff costs don't apply to just one center, they apply to all the centers in the local area. So we have to show that differently in the spreadsheet, and I'll do my best to explain that today and in more detail in a future webinar. Number 4 on your screen, the FTE commitments. This is similar to what we did last year, that the FTE commitment made by each required partner is by center. So Center 1, what is the partner contributing in FTEs? Center 2, what is the partner committing for FTEs? And then we add that all up in a summary spreadsheet that shows a partner's commitment across all centers. So I'll show you that today too. And the last is what I mentioned earlier. The OneStop operator costs have to be reflected in the OneStop operating budget. That means either as a shared cost that is distributed among all the partners or as a contribution of one partner toward that function. So we made other technical improvements to the budget spreadsheet based on the feedback received from many of you partners throughout the past year, and we hope that they are helpful for clarity. They are intended to give you more flexibility in identifying the costs to be shared. They are intended to make it more clear who's paying for or incurring the cost of each line item, and they're also intended to capture all the costs of the one-stop delivery system. Even if the partners are not sharing in some of those costs, it helps us understand the total cost of the one-stop operating system in each local area. So I'd like to show you a few of the tabs, and I apologize if this does not seem to be showing up clearly, but I will do my best to explain the main concepts that I want to get across today. As part of the mechanical changes to the budget spreadsheet, we had to adjust the tabs for FTE commitments. So if you see the top heading there, it says FTE Commitment Center 1. So the red font there in the red circle says this is the FTE commitment specific to this center, Center 1. And you fill it out just as you did last year to fill in each partner's commitment, whether it's on-site or providing program services on-site, or whether that FTE is providing it via direct linkage technology, or whether another partner is cross-trained in order to provide your program services. That is all reflected on this spreadsheet, which you all filled out last year. The next tab related to the FTEs is what I mentioned, the summary of all of a partner's FTE commitments across all centers. So we want to know, over all the centers, what is each partner committing in FTEs. So this tab with the all in parentheses on top is in the name of the tab, that will automatically sum all of the FTE commitments that you entered into the individual center tabs. So it automatically populates this data for you and gives us a nice summary view of every partner's commitment across the local area. This is, you have seen this a very similar portion of the spreadsheet in last year's version. So you still have your shared infrastructure costs on top in the green headings. And this one I'm showing you now is specific to Center 1. So yellow indicates where you will enter data, and there are plenty of rows for adding your own cost items or line items. For example, other facility costs, you can enter all of that and customize it to your local area. Other technology costs, other common identifier costs. Just you decide, and you are able to edit that those items. We're also likely going to unlock all of column A, which is where you enter the line items, so that even if it's a white row, you should be able to customize that line item to your local area. But in most cases, the yellow highlighting indicates where you have to manually enter the data and where you can edit the line items. Also, if you see the big long green arrow at the top, that column there that it's pointing to is where you would enter who's incurring that cost. So of the facility cost, let's just say the lease cost, which partner is incurring that cost of the lease? Which one is actually the payee? That will help us track down who's paying for what costs, which we were unable to do in last year's version. So that's for Center 1. Now, also for Center 1 is the shared delivery system cost, which shows up in the blue headings. So in this one, you see that this is specific to Center 1. So in Center 1, the only shared delivery system costs to enter in this tab are the costs that are specific to this center. So again, the example is the resource room specialist. That's a cost that all partners agreed to share, and that's a cost that is specific to this center, so it goes in this section. The shared delivery system costs that apply to every service location in the area or every center in the area, that will be entered in a different section of the tab. So again, the long blue arrow at the top, you see there is a column to enter which partner is incurring the cost. And then you can customize all of the first columns of what the line items are for the resource room materials or whatever it is that the partners are sharing. And the yellow indicates where you can manually enter data. And again, the white rows for the line items, we are also thinking about unlocking all of them so you can completely customize all line items. And the bottom arrow on the blue, the less other contributions specific to this center. So this is where you enter any non-cash contributions or in-kind staffing or any contributions toward the OneStop operator that are specific to this center. So that is a difference than the shared system costs that apply to all centers. This is center specific is the way that we are describing it. One other item is that on every tab of your center tabs are new notes sections. So there's a notes that you can manually enter an explanation on the cost allocation methodology if you're not using the FTE as your cost allocation methodology. There's also a note section for explaining anything about the partner responsible for payment. Maybe it's two partners that are providing or incurring that cost, then you could explain that in the narrative in the notes section. We also want your explanations of how you're paying for the OneStop operator to make sure that it's very clear. And notes on any non-cash or third-party contributions. Last year, even if amounts were entered in as non-cash contributions, we didn't actually know what those non-cash contributions were. So we wanted to add a section in the notes on the spreadsheet so that you could tell us what those non-cash contributions are, as well as the third-party contributions. What are they? Explain it in this box. And then anything else that you feel we need to know. And these notes sections will most likely be compared or provide you content that will be added to your narrative of the MOU template, section 12 of the template. So it would be good to make sure that when you enter notes in here that it aligns with your Section 12 of the MOU template and the narrative. Okay, so this is the other all tab. So remember I said, this is the all tab. The purpose of this tab is to sum all the shared delivery system costs across the centers. So the red font, as you see on the screen, will automatically populate with other center-specific system costs that you manually entered into Center 1, Center 2, Center 3, the tabs for those centers. So if you enter center-specific costs, so for example, if you enter a resource room specialist in every single center, that will automatically populate in this portion of the spreadsheet in the All tab within the parentheses. So it just pulls out all the center-specific shared system costs into this section. And for example, if your one-stop operator costs, if your local area has a one-stop operator for Center 1 and a different one-stop operator for Center 2, then those costs will be reflected in those individual center tabs. And this All tab in parentheses pulls all that and sums it so we can get the big picture view of all the costs related to the one-stop operator function in the local area. This All tab in parentheses also sums your partner contributions, your other contributions from the individual centers, and that gives us the sum of all contributions across the local area. And there's one more part to the shared delivery system cost that I'll show you next. Okay, so remember that there are two categories of shared delivery system costs. Costs that are specific to a center that we just talked about, and then costs that apply to all the centers in the local area. And let's stick with the same example, the board staff costs. Because board staff costs apply to all centers, you haven't entered those costs yet anywhere in the spreadsheet because you didn't enter them in Center 1 because they're not specific to Center 1. They apply to all centers. You didn't enter it in the tab for Center 2 because they're applicable to all centers in the local area. So this is the section of the spreadsheet of the All tab in parentheses that prompts you to manually enter the shared delivery system costs that apply to all the centers in the local area. So you manually enter all of your board staff costs in this section. And you manually enter all your insurance or your audit costs here. Because again, you haven't entered them anywhere else on the center tabs, so we have to have a place to capture those costs. If your one-stop operator oversees all the centers in your local area, it's the same one-stop operator across all centers, then this is also where you would enter your one-stop operator cost if it's shared proportionately among your partners. That's what that middle blue arrow is pointing to, the sum of the one-stop operator costs to apply to all centers in the local area. If your partners are not sharing in the one-stop operator costs, and maybe it's one or multiple partners are just covering that cost, then it would be added and where the third blue arrow is, the less other contributions that apply to all centers in the local area. So if your one-stop operator is being contributed outside of the shared costs, then you put it down and below in that bottom section. Probably a good time for me to pause because I realize that we just talked about a lot of concepts, and again, we know that we want to offer you a more technical assistance specific to the mechanics of the spreadsheet, but I'll pause here and see if you have any questions about what I just rambled on about. You can either type in the chat pod on the left of your screen, and I think if it's okay, Chelsea, we'll also open up the phone lines just to see if there are any questions by phone for what I just talked about the one-stop operating spreadsheet before we move on to the next section of the supplemental guidance. I welcome any questions you have.
Bethany, this is Mike Baker at Commerce.
Hi, Mike.
I'd add a quick comment to reinforce something you said earlier about using the notes boxes at the bottom of each sheet.
Yeah.
It's great for helping explain to the state reviewers what's going on, but those boxes are also useful for you to identify for each other what each partner has committed to. So if you've got multiple partners contributing something specific, say photocopier leases or whatever it might be, you can specify and put a little descriptor in those boxes that will help remind everybody what the numbers up above mean and what everybody agreed to. So those boxes are as much for you as they are for us.
Thank you.
Christy, I'm wondering when the spreadsheet will be available.
We are going to make it available as soon as possible. As soon as that webinar is confirmed and we're ready to invite everyone to join the webinar, we'll send it out. So very shortly. It's again, it's in the final approval stages. So we will make sure that we get it out to you as soon as possible.
So just to clarify, if there's another webinar on the spreadsheet?
Yeah, so we're hoping in 1 week from today, so the next WIOA Wednesday webinar on February 14th would be a webinar specifically about the spreadsheet, and we'd show you more of the mechanics and the technical side of the spreadsheet, more than just the concepts that I'm talking about today. But we will have to send out that invitation to you as soon as that webinar is confirmed. Okay, I have not seen any other questions come through. I hope I anticipate that it feels a little overwhelming at this point, and I understand if questions are going to naturally come up after the webinar, but we'll also have another time during this webinar for question and answers. And any questions that we're unable to answer we'll surely capture in a frequently asked questions document that we generate after the webinar. So I'll move on for now. So again, in part of the supplemental guidance, it includes revised MOU Section 12, which tells you what required content needs to be in your budget narrative. So, and if you remember from last year, in Section 12, or throughout the MOU template, when the dot points are in italicized font, that means that content is required, and that also means that the state level review teams will look for that content in your narrative section of your MOU. So what I'm explaining now is the new additions to the Section 12 required content narrative. So the first is, if you join the November 8th webinar, this is a repeat. This did not change. That pending any additional guidance about affiliate or specialized centers, we do want you to affirm that in the narrative that each required partner meets the minimum FTE commitment of 0.25 FTEs in each center, including comprehensive centers and affiliate or specialized centers. So this was kind of it was not as formal in previous versions of the governor's guidelines. So we tried to formalize it in this revision to the MOU Section 12. Another new dot point is that we want you to explain any source and purpose of non-cash contributions, third-party in-kind contributions, and contributions toward the OneStop operator. Again, filling in the spreadsheet with the numbers helps, but we need the narrative to explain what's really going on. Again, as Mike said, for your benefit and for ours. We also want you to affirm in the narrative the entity designated to reconcile the budget, the budgeted to actual costs. We think that would be helpful to identify that individual who's been designated in your MOU narratives and explain how frequently reconciliation will occur and explain who is responsible for completing it. Another item that will be required of you, as I mentioned before, is the outcome report for an annual budget negotiations for PY18. This is a new form. Last year, you submitted an outcome report for your MOU negotiations. This year's report is just for your annual budget negotiations. And I'll show you a copy of that here in a few slides. And that's the one that's due April 15th. The entity designated to reconcile the budget, the budgeted to actual costs, we think that would be helpful to identify that individual who's been designated in your MOU narratives and explain how frequently reconciliation will occur and explain who is responsible for completing it. The last updated item is your MOU, your signed amended MOU with the new Section 12 narrative, as well as your one-stop operating budget is due by 6/30/2018 because it takes effect July 1st. This is the new form. It simply tells us, you mark to us whether partners agreed, and if they didn't, why, and which partner didn't agree, and is it related to infrastructure costs or other. And you simply mark the boxes, fill in the appropriate boxes, and with a little bit of an explanation, and then you get your local workforce board chair and the CEOs to sign that document, and you submit it to Michael Baker on the email address listed, which is WIOA-plans-MOUs@illinoisworknet.com. This form is available to download and fill out from the Illinois WorkNet portal, the WIOA Implementation Resources portal, and you can go to that site and download it and fill it out and then submit it. So the purpose of this form is really just to guide the state level partners in knowing whether any technical assistance is needed or whether a state level remediation team is needed to avoid an impasse. So that's why we require this to be submitted on April 15th, so then that can allow time for the state remediation teams to help out if needed. So this is just a simply recap of the concepts that are revised in the MOU template changes. I will pause again here before we move on to the periodic reconciliation explanations. And I invite any questions you have in the chat pod or in by phones. And Chelsea, thank you very much. She put in the left side of your screens the link to where you can download those documents I told you about, including the advanced release of the governor's guidelines and the outcome report. And she also included the email address, which is to Michael Baker, to submit your budgets and your revised MOUs. Any questions about the MOU template changes? Okay, seeing none and hearing none, I will move on to the reconciliation of budgeted to actual costs for PY 2017, the current program year. And the supplemental guidance, the reason we're talking about it today is because the supplemental guidance provides guidance on the periodic reconciliation process. And we held a WIOA Wednesday webinar on this last week. Today, I'm going to highlight the main concepts of the reconciliation process and highlight some of the questions and answers that came up since last week's webinar. I also have to clarify one of the answers that I gave last week, so I'll highlight that in another slide. And I just wanted this slide is just to give you the source of the requirement for periodic reconciliation. If you want to go read it, it's in Training and Employment Guidance Letter, or TEGL 1716. And the requirement is that you must do periodic reconciliation of budgeted to actual shared costs, and that infrastructure costs and local service delivery system costs are included in that requirement. And the whole purpose of all that is to ensure that each partner shares in the cost proportionate to the benefit that that partner receives by being in the center. So as I said last week, we held the webinar. It was to introduce the handbook for conducting periodic reconciliation for program year 2017, and that's the link that you can go get that handbook for. So the WIOA Interagency Workgroup released this handbook, which is not policy, but it is more of a resource to support those who are actually performing reconciliation. So it provides guidelines and suggestions. It's not policy or requirements. The WIOA Wednesday webinar last week on January 31st explained all that, but the handbook is also, the main points that I think are important to understand are, one, the local workforce board chair determines the frequency of the reconciliation in the local area. Two, the chair also identifies the individual who is responsible for performing reconciliation in the local area. And then that individual who is responsible for reconciliation develops the process for identifying actual costs. So there's a couple things about these. One, we're not suggesting that every required partner must sign on or approve or vote to determine the frequency or the individual responsible for performing reconciliation. We think the board chair, in coordination with the partners necessary and the person who's actually going to do it, they'll work together and make sure that it's clear who is responsible for it. And the individual responsible then is, when we say develops the process, that means you also determine locally what documentation is required to verify actual costs incurred. That handbook that I talked about does not spell out what documentation you need to verify those costs. That's a local decision, and the individual responsible for reconciliation can work that out locally with the partners who are actually incurring the costs. So this is what in the supplemental guidance to the governor's guidelines spells out, that the local workforce board chair is the one who determines the frequency. It has to be at least semi-annually in Illinois. So that means at least 6 months. You can do it more frequently if you want to, such as quarterly, but we're only requiring you to do it at every 6 months. And that's on page 4 of the document of the supplemental guidance, if you want to go read that fully. This is just for clarity of terms. I mentioned this last week, but I think it's worth noting that the reconciliation period is the time when the actual costs are incurred. So during that 6-month period, for example, from July 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017, that's the reconciliation period in which costs are incurred. The reconciliation process happens after that. So once that period ends, then the reconciliation process starts. And that generally should take within 60 calendar days of the end of the reconciliation period, or 60 calendar days of the end of December 31st. So that's also spelled out in the handbook. So now I'd like to just go over some of the frequently asked questions that we got last week after the webinar. And these frequently asked questions have been posted to the Illinois WorkNet, the WIOA implementation portal, under the FAQ section. And if you type in MOU budget reconciliation in the search, it'll automatically pop up all the question and answers that we generated as a result of last week's webinar. So one of them is a good question: if the OneStop operator is invoicing all the required partners for actual costs as the bills come in, does the local area need to perform the periodic reconciliation using the reconciliation spreadsheet that was issued with the handbook? The answer is, if you are billing for actual costs as they come in, then you don't need to really go through the reconciliation process as laid out in the handbook, because the invoices are already accounting for any variances between what was budgeted and what is actual. So if you're billing as is for actual costs as they come in, then that covers the requirement. Another question that came in is, well, okay, if we're billing as invoices come in for actual costs and partners are paying for actual costs as they come in, then do you still need to complete what we call the matrix of benefits received by partner? So the handbook included a matrix that says, here are the programmatic benefits and here are the other benefits that partners receive by sharing in, by providing their services in each center. And it just is a way to document what each partner's benefit is by participating in that center. So this question says, well, if we invoice for actual costs as they come in, then do we have to fill out that matrix? So the answer is it's not a requirement for you to do that, but it's recommended that if you don't fill out the matrix of benefits received by partner that was suggested in the handbook, you at least need to document it in some way. So there's verification that costs are shared proportionately to the benefits received by partner, because that is something that is in federal regulations, and that's something that we anticipate federal reviewers would want to come in and verify that costs are proportionately shared among the partners. So you need to document it in some way, either through the matrix or for some other document or process that you use locally. It just needs to be documented somehow. Another question was, are the individuals responsible for reconciliation required to submit the completed reconciliation spreadsheet and the completed matrix of benefits received by partner to the WIOA Interagency Work Group, which is the state-level administrators? No, there is not a requirement to submit the reconciliation spreadsheet or the matrix of benefits received by partner because this is a local process. The only time that you would send it in is if you're having a technical issue or if and need some assistance, or if partners are not agreeing. And if partners are not agreeing, then you try to follow the process that you outlined in your local MOUs for resolving disputes. If that still doesn't work, then you can send your reconciliation spreadsheet and any documentation to explain what's going on to the same email address to the state, Michael Baker at Commerce. And then that will be brought to the WIOA Interagency Work Group to help figure out what to do next to get over the disagreement or whatever the issue is. So you do not have to submit everything unless there's a problem. That's the short answer. I mentioned this before, but one question was what documentation is required to verify actual costs. The short answer is that that's a local decision, and the individual responsible for reconciliation works that out with the partners that are incurring the costs. The handbook that we talk about does not mention specific documentation that's required. It's a local decision. I believe this is the last question that I'll highlight, and then we can open it up for questions again. Does the threshold, so there's a threshold that is explained in the supplemental guidance as well as in the handbook in more detail, that, you know, if a budget line item has a big variance between what was budgeted versus what actual cost came in, then it might trigger the need for a full MOU amendment with new signatures and everything. So the threshold that we're talking about is if a line item variance is more than 15% than the budgeted amount and accounts for 10% of the total budget, that warrants a full MOU budget amendment and agreement. So the opposite is true. If a variance is less than that, then you can just handle it through the reconciliation process. If it's just a regular variance and it's not something that will, if it's just a smaller variance, then handle it through the reconciliation process, and every partner has to pay a little bit more than what budgeted to cover that additional cost. But if it's not significant enough to require a full MOU amendment, that's the threshold that we're talking about. On the other hand, if costs come in significantly less than budgeted, so yay for everybody, you have to pay less, then the answer is the MOU, that an MOU budget amendment is not required. Everyone just gets a credit and can celebrate. I misstated that in the webinar last week, so I wanted to highlight it here, that if costs come in significantly less, say 15% less than budgeted, then an MOU amendment is not required. You can just handle it through the reconciliation process. So that's a correction on my part. Okay, so I'd like to open it up to questions about the reconciliation process or about anything else. And again, you're welcome to type on the left side of your chat pods, or we can open the phone lines and you can ask if you're joining us by phone. I see one question. The handbook states that if the state agency is the leaseholder, budgeted costs can be used in the reconciliation if actual costs are not known. Does that apply to other partners that can't provide actual costs? We were really building that in as a guideline for if the state partners, because some state partners might have to go through CMS and might not know their actual costs for, let's say, 3 to 6 months after the fact. And in that case, whether it's a regardless of what the cost is, you can't determine the actual cost until that state process happens. So the handbook is specific to the state agency partners that can't provide the actual cost until far after the fact. So that was what it was intended to do, specific on the state partners. I don't know at this point a scenario where other partners wouldn't be able to provide their actual costs in a timely manner. And if there's a situation that you know of specifically that could happen with a non-state partner, let me know and we'll talk about it. But I think we're really trying to hedge for the state level, the state program administrators that just have to go through the state billing process that takes longer. And yes, you're right though that the handbook does say you can use budgeted costs in that case. So that's a guideline, I would say. I'll go back to slide 18. The next question is on slide 18, it states that the one-stop operator cost must be reflected as either a shared cost or a contribution toward the one-stop operator. Yes, I can clarify. I'll get to the slide first, and then I'll clarify. Okay, so one-stop operator costs, what we're trying to do is just understand how they're being covered. And we know that partners might agree to share to cover the cost of the one-stop operator so that the total cost of the one-stop operator will be split proportionately among all the partners and every partner will pay their share. So if that's the case, then it would be entered as a shared cost, shared system cost in the spreadsheet. But then there's a case where maybe one partner is essentially covering the cost of the one-stop operator. Then that would be shown not as a shared cost because partners are not sharing proportionately to cover that cost. Rather, it would be one partner's contribution toward the one-stop operator function, and that would be entered in a different part of the spreadsheet. I hope that answers your question. If not, please let me know. Where, the question was where would that be entered? There's two different places, and that I think what would be best is to show you on the more technical webinar, but I can show you here. There's essentially three different parts of shared system costs, whether it's shared among all partners or a contribution. So this is the screen here. If the partners are agreeing to share in the one-stop operator costs, then it would be entered in the shared cost up here, one-stop operator costs, shared and split among partners. Doesn't have a row number, so it's the second from the sum of center-specific one-stop operator costs. It's the second blue arrow is where I'm referring to. If it's a contribution that maybe only one or two partners are contributing toward the cost, then that's entered in the bottom blue box, the last blue arrow, where it's a contribution, an other contribution. It's not a cost that's shared proportionally among partners. It's an other contribution. Mike, do you have anything else to add about that?
Nope, that's clear to me.
And again, we'll do our best to provide the specifics when we can kind of show you live how the spreadsheet works next week if we're able to do that for you. Another question is, are the costs included in the reconciliation actual or accrued? Do the costs need to be paid before they can be included, or do they just need to be incurred? So the handbook for reconciliation is silent on this, and we think it's best left up to the local partners to agree on whether you're going to use accrued or cash basis. And that question came up last week, and there's not one good answer. We think everyone probably has a different answer. We think it's best up to local discretion and to describe that in your agreements. So I apologize that I probably can't provide you more concrete a requirement, so to speak, but we think it's best that you decide locally and get everyone to agree. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in on the chat pod. Is there any by phone? If you wanted to ask a question but haven't had a chance yet, is there any other questions you would like to ask about anything we presented today? Are any of the partners who helped us draft either the reconciliation handbook or any portion of the supplemental guidance, is there anything that I missed that you would like to share?
Bethany, I would add one reason for holding on to the local documentation. Bethany's right. You don't need to turn that into us, but it's possible Department of Labor would monitor us, or monitors from the state agencies might come out. So that would be one of the things they would want to look at. So you need to hold on to those for monitoring purposes as well.
Yeah, the handbook really tries to, for reconciliation purposes, really tries to prepare you in thinking things through so that, if a monitoring does happen, that you'll have your processes in place and local documentation gathered, as Mike said. I do see someone typing in the chat pod, so I'm going to pause a minute to see if that question comes in, and anyone else is welcome to speak by phone if you do have a question in the meantime. Okay, here's the question. If DOL comes in to monitor, what kind of documentation do you think would suffice for the reconciliation? I understand that it is up to us, but will they be satisfied with an email from a partner, or will they want to see actual invoices? Would anyone else like to offer their thoughts on that? Again, we think this is a local process. The individual responsible for reconciliation should work out and be confident in what the actual costs are, especially working with the partners that are incurring the actual costs. If you work together and understand what documentation is available, whether it's an invoice or whether it's another documentation, I think that's what we're saying is it's a local decision. But does anyone else have any thoughts about what DOL would look for verification of actual costs? We'll see if we can find that, any more guidance about that, and if so, we'll put it in the frequently asked questions section of the reconciliation on the website, the Illinois WorkNet site, and add it there, Leanne. And unless anyone else is able to speak to it now, which it doesn't sound like we are, we'll just try to find out, and if we can, we'll put it in that frequently asked questions. I just repeated myself, but hope that addresses your question.
Hello, this is Calvin.
Hi, Calvin.
Yes, I would think just a common or an answer to that question, it would be an invoice that could be justified.
Yeah.
If you're leaving it to the local, to the locals to do it, it would be an invoice that could be justified. So I don't know if we want to make it that complicated.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. You would think an invoice shows directly what the cost is and what was
exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. But short of that, I don't know that we can provide anything else specific that
exactly
that's required. I think that local areas can come up with their own verification. But again, we'll try to find out if there's any more specifics we can add for guidance. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in and or hearing any by phone. So that is the end of our presentation for today. So I thank you for bearing with us through these level of details. And again, we'll get that calendar invitation out to you for the webinar that will focus specifically on the spreadsheet. So thank you.